It is the 7th model introduced in the OG ZOIDS collaboration lineup, but the second introduced in the second run in 2024. It is ZID06 S-Sworder, with a kit of Hyper Charge Blade, Clock Rage, Terminate, Flight Legs, and the leg ability of Barrage, which grants an anti-jammer effect to self when charging Metaphors. Now, one thing any OG ZOIDS fan will understand is when it comes to making robot animals, there's most certainly no lack of or shortage of possible candidates or references or ideas you can pull from. And boy, do they love their pterodactyl and flying type. And S-Sworder here, who's based off of the iconic Storm Sworder in the series, is most certainly no exception to this. While he's not packing any brand new skills in comparison to one or two others of the lineup, it still is not any reason to knock him or discount him for what he brings to the table. Hyper Charge Blade on the head is a melee attribute skill that gets a damage bonus relative to the user's charge gauge, both in the sense that it consumes, but also grants the damage relative to charge. It will consume about up to 15% of the charge upon activation, or 30% if it's not capped at rank 5 or higher, but you also get a much higher damage output at about ×3 or so of whatever your charge percentage is, as additional bonus to your base power when attacking. So this is an exceptionally powerful charge-reliant skill that doesn't necessarily need a charge in order to use it, but if you have the charge, you can most certainly benefit from it with some higher damage output. Clock Rage on the right arm is another melee attribute skill which gets a punish in a rather strange way that you don't see all that often. But to explain Clock Rage briefly, it essentially is a skill that has a relatively decent base damage and output, but it also gets a relatively high bonus damage tied to the opponent's heat of the respective part. So that means if you're fighting someone who has a much higher or equal to heat stat than what S-Sworder's right arm brings to the table, you're basically punishing them for trying to be faster than S-Sworder, which gives you extra damage on top of that. With a relatively high base heat in the mid-700s for both heating and cooling, it's going to be pretty tough to outrun this guy off the table. But with the base power in the 1100, almost 1200 as well, even if he isn't punishing anybody for trying to be faster than him, it's still going to be a relatively painful hit all the same. Terminate on the left arm is a conventional melee skill that plays very similarly to what a lot of OG Metarock fans would identify as the original Destroy back in the Game Boy Color and Game Boy era, where if you attack a foe from the backside in their cooldown phase, you have a chance to instantly destroy the part that it's targeting in question. Now, it's not guaranteeing that it's going to, but you have a very high percentage of it when you actually attack them in their cool phase. Whereas you attack them in their heating phase and facing you, more than likely it's just going to be dealing standard damage and nothing special. But with also relatively high heat and cooling in the low 800s and high 600s, he's already got a pretty high base speed on the table when it comes to being able to get to the line and from it very quickly. Flight Legs means he's going to have relatively high base mobility and evade on top of that, at the cost of having relatively light armor and a non-existent heavy support, as you see there at a 0 out of 0, but also supplying a weakness to anti-air. So that means if anyone is packing anti-air or any similar skill that can knock him out of the sky, this is most certainly going to be shooting down this pterodactyl type a whole lot faster than what you'd really hope for. But when it comes to speed, though, he really is almost unmatched. With the base mobility at almost 1100 means he is most certainly going to be zooming off the center line when the fight says go. And an evade of 2102 also is par for the course with a lot of acrobatic type flight legs, which means it's going to be pretty hard to land a hit on him, while he's able to dodge or graze relatively easily. A melee resist of 1146 means he can most certainly hold his own up close and personal fairly well, and a shoot resist of 828 isn't too shabby either, which means compared to most other flight legs which have almost no damage reduction whatsoever and are basically paper armored or glass cannons, S-Sworder isn't necessarily in that same bracket and can kind of hold his own fairly well. When it comes to armor, he also is packing some pretty fair numbers, but just a little lighter on the end to kind of keep that high mobility and high agility theme going, with a head armor of about 3600, arms about 3419 each, and legs at just shy of 3500. Lighter on the armor, like I said, but not enough to consider him a glass cannon. So he can take a hit or two fairly well, but If it's a supercharged hit or anything like anti-air, most certainly going to go down very easy. All this being said, though, as a pure set score, I honestly still have to rate S-Sworder a relatively middle of the ground 6.5 out of 10. While his kit is relatively diverse in the sense that nothing really contradicts or conflicts with something else, and he can use basically any of his skills very consistently, Barrage also gives him an extra level of synergy that you really don't count for when putting flight legs on your team and trying to pay attention to, because that anti-jammer effect to self will effectively negate his anti-air weakness for 2 hits. So if anyone does manage to bring anti-air to the table, as long as you're able to get at least 1 Metaforce charge in and get that effect going, you're essentially in the clear, and you can still fight freely before you have to apply it again. Just make sure that you don't try to abuse that over and over, and just try to keep juggling it fairly until the one with anti-air is taken down, and of course it's safe to use to do so freely without having to stagger uses. And of course, between Hyper Charge Blade, Clock Rage, and Terminate, like I said, it's a very diverse kit that doesn't conflict with anything and still well-rounded that you really can't go wrong with using anything. As mixed parts, though, I do have to rate him equally at a 6.5 out of 10 for these same reasons. Hyper Charge Blade, Clock Rage, and Terminate are all relatively solid skills that you can use pretty dependently, reliably, and moderately easily, depending on how you choose to use them and where, especially with the extra punish that each of these has based on certain conditions. But the Flight Legs with Barrage is an extra charm that I don't really think you'll be able to afford missing if you do try to go after him, because that very high base speed and mobility, and the ability to negate its own anti-air weakness for up to 2 hits when activated, is something that's really, really hard to argue against.